In my head, you have held me in your arms. In my head, I've been witness to your charms 1,000 times. You have sung me a love song in my head.
You're very welcome to the episode 2, series 2 of the Attic Sessions. It is episode 28. Peter keeps on telling me, but I like this notion that we're into our second season. And you are very welcome to the Attic Sessions. And yes, Ireland is emerging from lockdown. It's true, but we're not really yet. We feel safer in the attic, and it gives us the chance to talk to some people that we wouldn't have otherwise not easily lured over to Rathfarnham, and that includes our latest guest, who is Mary Costello, who is based in gorgeous Kinvara in County Galway. And you're very welcome to the attic, Mary. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks for having me, Nessa.
Not at all. I'll just tell people a little. I don't think people need to know or need to be told a lot about you, but just to say that you have been incredibly successful in the field of fiction with 3 works to date, a collection of short stories called The China Factory, which was published in 2014, and that was then followed by grabs her notes, it's behind me, The Academy Street. Extraordinarily successful novel. And then most recently last year in October, your second novel, The River Capture, was published by Canongate, and already it's been gleaning plaudits, shortlisted for the Novel of the Year at the Irish Book Awards, for Novel of the Year at the Dalkey Literary Awards this June, and also for the Kerry Group Irish Novel of the Year down at Listowel. So wonderful reaction, and we're going to talk hopefully a bit more about the novel in a minute. But can I bring you back to the beginning, I suppose, that to get a sense of how the writing developed and became part of your life. Like, as a child, were you reading a lot? Were you thinking about writing things, or how did that happen?
I'm not aware that I was. I suppose I was in many ways. I remember in school, I grew up in the country, not far from here. And so I went to a small 2-teacher school, and it was very safe. And I suppose very nurturing looking back on it. I would have said I probably had a sheltered upbringing in many ways. So I was reading. I remember writing a poem when I was about in 4th class, and the teacher praising it. That's about all the creative writing I remember from primary school. And I did read, not voraciously, I read the usual Enid Blyton and all the little series that children read. And we had a mobile library that came every Wednesday afternoon, Galway County Council, and it's still on the go, comes into Kinvara every second Wednesday afternoon. But in those days, it went to all the country schools after school. So after school on a Wednesday afternoon, you could go out and climb the little steps, and it was a big wagon, and choose books. So I remember always doing that. The house, we had some books. Most of my aunts and uncles were teachers, so we often got books as presents. But my parents wouldn't have been reading novels. They wouldn't have had time even. Mm-hmm. But writing didn't really figure until I had finished college. I had studied English in college. I loved English in secondary school too. Poetry mostly would have registered, but there's no way. I never wrote poems, and I never wrote stories.
And I suppose you and me are kind of a similar generation, so the writers we were studying tended to be dead and rarely female, so there wasn't a kind of a sense of a living tradition of literature. Like, when did you go to your first reading? I mean, attending somebody else's reading?
When I had China Factory, I think. Maybe, no, I think I was in my 40s.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't have been aware that and I meet people who were on the scene in the 70s, and they're talking about these, great series in places like Toners, and that went completely beyond me. And, you're studying literature in UCD and not aware that there was a living tradition of writers in my own town. And so it was really only in the 90s when I started writing myself that I started going to hear living writers. So I guess that's a great difference for people now. They, you know, are aware, they're having the opportunities to meet writers, go to events, writers come into schools. But certainly when we were doing it, no, you know. And you studied to be a teacher.
I went to St. Pat's in Drumcondra, so you have to study education, obviously, and then English was my other primary subject. And as I said, poetry, I remember, you know, in secondary school and in college being very taken with poetry rather than novels or short stories. But I had certainly never dreamt about being a writer or felt this urge to be a writer until I was out of college and I was teaching in Tala. And I went through a period, I've often talked about this, where I couldn't sleep. You know, I was happy. I loved my job. I was going out with the man that I eventually married. And everything seemed fine. But I went through several months of severe insomnia. And I knew something was gnawing at me, but I had no idea what was wrong. Something was wrong. I couldn't put a finger on it. And then one night it came to me, I want to write. Not that I want to be a writer, I want to write. So I went to an evening class up at a VC class. Remember in the days when you get this booklet and the evening classes, you could do mechanics or all that. So there was a creative writing class up in Furhouse. I lived in Turnure at the time. And I went to that and started writing stories. And the man who ran the class worked in the tire factory in Ballyfermot, Semperit. He's passed away now. He's a lovely man. And there I wrote a few stories and I was absolutely petrified reading anything in public. But I got a little bit of confidence. And a few months later, I went to the Stoll Writers Week. Not in a workshop or anything. I went to, I'd heard about it somehow or other. And there I heard the names of Raymond Carver, Joyce Carol Oates, Flannery O'Connor, Ian McEwan, Alison Rowe. So it was like the world opened up to me. I read voraciously. I had found my kin, and that was the beginning. And then, after that, I wrote a story in the months after that, and sent it to the Sunday Tribune. I did not know any other writers. I wasn't part of any writing community, but I sent it to the Sunday Tribune and was published. That was my first story. I was about 25, I think, 26.
So that was the Kieran Carty New Irish Writing. Wow, yeah.
And then I wrote another story maybe a year after that, and that was published and it was shortlisted for the Hennessy. And it was around the same time that Joseph O'Connor and Colin McCann, around that era, early 90s. I had got married and when I was 23 and I was living in Temple Oak and teaching in Tallaght. So I was fully, you know, I didn't have any friends who were writers. I didn't know that world at all. So this was a nice little boost. And but I was reading voraciously. I was reading everything that came out of Ireland that was being published. And I relied on Eileen Battersby every Saturday in the Irish Times. It was my big thrill getting the Irish Times and the books pages. And that's how I found Alice Munro way back, probably maybe around 1987, 88. Yeah. And so then I'm in my mid-20s to late 20s, and further than that, I stopped writing, or I didn't entirely stop writing, but I didn't send out more stories. Perhaps I sent out one or two and they were rejected after that, but I was teaching full-time and I was married and I couldn't seem to accommodate writing as well. So writing slipped into the background, it slipped into the margins of my life. Yeah. It never went away, but I stopped talking about it. I wasn't friends with any writers, so it didn't impinge upon me. I didn't miss anything. I had no social life with writers, but it slipped into the margins of my life. It went underground. And after a while, I grew to I grew to see it as a burden. I viewed writing as a burden because it wouldn't go away entirely. Stories would bubble up and I would write them and I would work on them for a few months maybe and feel some degree of satisfaction. It was almost like a purging. And I'd put it away and then I'd say, that's it, I can give it up again. And then a few months later, another story would bubble up and I would have to write it. And it became kind of a secret activity. It felt like I was having an affair or something. You know, it was something that I never talked about, and I didn't feel entirely good about because I didn't know where I was. I was in some liminal space between, I couldn't call myself a writer, and nobody knew I was writing. So this continued, I even attempted a novel. Everything was, because I was a teacher, I was free in the summer. I didn't have children. I was free every evening. And right into my 30s, I did this. But of course, I was developing my taste as well, because I knew what I liked and I knew the writers I admired. And my marriage broke up after 10 years. And then, as I say, I was teaching full time. But so I had a few years then when things were difficult. But the writing wouldn't go away, and it sort of pestered me. So by the time I got into my 40s, I thought, I'm going to have to give this one last shot. So I sent some stories to the Stinging Fly, who I didn't really know about. I picked up the magazine in Hodges Figgis or Waterstones, or one of those. And that's how the two stories were published. And then they published my collection. And that's how it started. I was old. I felt quite old,
And if I had a fiver for every writer who I've talked to here in the attic sessions, as well as everything else, who talked about the difference that the Stinging Fly made to them and their careers, like they have just discovered so many fantastic fiction writers and given them that opportunity, But you had started. So it was sort of like a restart, I suppose.
Yes. In fact, because when I sent the stories to Declan, one of the first, after I met him, he said, do you have any more? And I said, I do. I had about, 8 or 10 stories. Well, I wrote a few more then for the collection, but I did have probably, 18 or 20 years work,
So that overnight success was like on the back of 20 years of hard graft. Yeah.
There's very few, well, there are some overnight successes, but I certainly wouldn't be one of them.
And would you think that like the American tradition had played much more into those first stories than what was happening elsewhere in Ireland?
Significantly, yeah. I had read Edna O'Brien when I was younger, and I hadn't heard of Maeve Brennan until that time when I started to write myself, around maybe 2012 when China Factory was published, maybe a little bit before that. But I had read Mary Lavin, I'd read the Irish women writers, and of course the males. I loved McGahern stories. But it was the American tradition, I have to say, that spoke to me. I have to say there was one other collection that was very important to me, or one other writer, oddly enough, Ian McEwan's short stories, which I don't often hear cited. But First Love, Last Rites, and In Between the Sheets were two of the earliest collections I read of short stories, because until I entered the world of writing, I didn't know contemporary short stories. Obviously, I had done Dubliners in college, but I hadn't been reading contemporary short stories. And In Between the Sheets and First Love, Last Rites really had a profound effect on me. And I think probably my first few stories, I was emulating those stories. But yes, Carver, of course, Flannery O'Connor, Mavis Gallant, but Alice Munro in particular. Alice Munro, and I know she is very popular now, but back then she wasn't. This is 1988, 87, 88. She was not widely known, and I think it was Eileen Battersby who mentioned her, and I had to order the book in, there were, way back then, I think and I can't know if it was Hodges Figgis, I think it was on the right-hand side as you go down Dawson Street. I know they switched over, but they used to have imports. They used to have tables of imported paperbacks from America there. Do you remember those?
Yes.
You'd always get the unusual, the nice, they're always very exciting to look at those. But so Alice Munro was, I remember...
Green's bookshop did that as well. If you remember, on Nassau Street.
Yeah, too. It became the short shop Germans or something like that afterwards. But I remember I think it was the summer of 1988, I was on a sun holiday with my husband in Greece or somewhere like that. It was very, very hot. Neither of us even liked the sun, and we just made a grave mistake going there. It was the first time ever. But I had brought a few Alice Munros. I had just discovered her. And I sat in the far corner of the hotel lobby in a dark corner, and I spend my days reading there. And it was torture to have to leave that corner and come out into the light of day or get dressed and go for dinner or anything, because I just wanted to be immersed in rural Ontario. It was, now she's going to be 89 next week, actually. The 10th of July is her birthday. I know all the birthdays of my icons, but are my heroes. But she, my mother's younger than her, but she represented a lot of my mother's generation in many ways. My mother grew up in rural Ireland. She grew up in rural Canada. And even though they were a million miles away in every way, there was something about her that really spoke to me. The lives of girls and women, of course, but also the interior life. She gave it its due, the same as, whether I'm talking about Joyce or Marilyn Robinson or anybody, those writers who give the inner life their due is what attracts me. And she certainly did. And I remember reading an essay by Kavanagh where he talked about, I think it's in Preoccupations, or maybe the government at the time. He's talking about, he's writing about Kavanagh. And he said that when he was a young poet, he had studied in Belfast, and John Donne and Shakespeare and Milton and everything. And they were the big poets. They were English, and they were from an academic, or they were certainly from an intellectual background and a very, high, lofty sphere. And suddenly he read Kavanagh, and he was reading about Guthrie gaps and headlands and ploughs and wet rain and hills. And suddenly he realized, that was the moment, he said, he realized when the ordinary and the everyday and the agriculture were worthy of poetry too. Yeah. And it was, an epiphany for him. Well, I had something similar. Oh yeah, he said, he mentioned blue stone that was used to treat potatoes for blight. And he came on that word, and it had the moment, because he grew up on a farm, he knew about blight and treating them with bluestone. And I remember reading a lot of Alice Munro and feeling that same kinship. Even though I was younger than her own daughters, she spoke to me in that way. And it was my bluestone moment, potato blight moment. I compared it in my own small way to that moment when things suddenly fit for me,
Yeah, so finding yourself, finding the kind of the conversation that you wanted to be part of.
Yes, I suppose. She came to read in Trinity way back, I think maybe around 1996. The book that was out, I think, was Open Secrets, and I had it in hardback, and I went to hear her speak. She wasn't that widely known. She was in one of the big theatres in Trinity, and I went in well ahead of it and everything. And, I loved her so much, and I was very nervous. Will I go up and get my book signed afterwards? Will I have the nerve? And I was absolutely petrified and afraid, and, but I did. And I, almost knelt down, and I told her she was a great hero of mine, and I tried to write, and she wished me very good luck. And she said, I'm sure you're about my age of my daughters, and I hope, and she signed my book, and I was, nervously coming down, shaking,
Wonderful. It's great to actually get the chance to talk to somebody who's made that sort of importance. You should send her a message for her birthday, because
I should.
She'd love to hear that. So the next work was Academy Street, and I mean, I've said it to you before. I'm prepared to risk saying it on camera. I thought it was a wonderful book about the emigrant experience, and it came out at a kind of a similar time to another well-known book about the Irish emigrant experience that was getting a lot more attention than yours. But for me, your book just had a trueness, that sense of, you talked about the interior life of the woman. I believed in your protagonist and her experiences. But you, I don't think, lived as an emigrant at any point. So what drew you to that topic?
There is a part of it is there's some biographical details from my mother's family. I had written a short story called You Fill Up My Senses in the China factory. It's about a little girl who's in love with her mother in a way, and her mother had grown up in a big old house called Easterfield, and her mother had died when she was 3, and this little girl had stayed with me. So I had an image of her all the time, losing her mother. And my own mother grew up in a big old house, and I modelled Easterfield on it. It's in County Galway, and it was a big old house that had been built in the 16th or 17th century, and it had been a big estate, and it was much reduced. And her family came in, bought it in the early 20th century, in 1912. My grandfather bought it. But it had been once a fine place, and there had been 2 stairs and lots of gracious rooms and everything. But of course, by the time I came along and my uncle had inherited it, and it was neglected, you know, you would need £1 million way back in the 60s or 70s to renovate it and everything. But my mother had not seen it as a romantic house at all, because to her it was a big cold house, you know, it's 2 stairs and dark corridors and a basement and everything. But I had been very aware when I was young. I was very close to my mother. I still am. But at some stage, maybe when I was 6 or 7 or 8, I realized that she had lost her mother when she was that age, when she was 3. And I remember thinking, how could you lose your mother? I remember thinking of the little girl that my mother had been. And I remember thinking, what must have been like to lose your mother? It was the most shocking thing to me. So, but my mother did have older sisters at the time her mother died, and they had been away in boarding school in Tuam. And when the mother died, they were pulled out of school and they didn't return. And I often wondered, their friends went on and they became teachers or, you know, doctors or something. And I often wondered about the knock-on effect generations down when the loss of a parent, a severe trauma in a family, but the loss of a parent in particular, how it can change the trajectory of the whole family. And their lifestyles became different, and how the knock-on effects down through generations might have been in play as well. But one of my mother's sisters, Carmel, became a nurse. She trained in Dublin and nursed for a few years in the Richmond, and then went off to America, and she lived in New York. And she only stayed there for 4 years, and then she returned and got married, lived in Galway. And I knew her, you know, she's still with us. She's 87 now, so a very sweet woman. And but when we were small and we go to visit her, she had a sort of an American color, an American aura. You know, she had those soda fountains, the tall red ones you squirt out. And she used American language still glamour. A little bit. Yeah, she had glamour, and she was very beautiful in her day. And she, you know, smoked a cigarette with a cigarette holder, and she had lovely handbags and shoes. But when another sister and brother had also immigrated. So when we were young, when we were small, photographs would come home from America, and it looked very glamorous. You know, my aunts and uncles were dressed up beautifully in satin dresses, and it looked like they were going to parties on the Upper West Side. I always say they were probably going to a Cayley in the Bronx or somewhere, or a GA match or something, but they looked very glamorous. Yeah. And they were young and very good looking. And my uncle looked just like the Kennedys, blonde and blue-eyed. And there was a time, and I actually thought we were related to the Kennedys. You know, when you're small and the Kennedys were big at the time. But my aunt eventually came back home. But my mother, a few years before I wrote Academy Street, my mother and my aunt were out for dinner one night, and I was with them, and we were talking, and I was always intrigued by Carmel's story, my aunt's story. She lived in Manhattan. She nursed in the Presbyterian, it's part of Columbia, one of the big hospitals. And she would tell me stories. And that night, for some reason, my mother said, they used to write to each other in the 60s, obviously. And she said something like, where's this you lived, Carmel? Where is this? What was it? Oh, 512 Academy Street. And Carmel said, that's right. My mother had remembered the address after all these years. And I heard. And I just thought, I had it immediately. I had an image of the whole life of her. And she nursed Roosevelt, and there were some famous people there. Edith Piaf was in hospital at the time. Marilyn Monroe was over on the psych ward in the private wing. So she had a lot of stories like this. And I was intrigued. So I had my character and I had my little girl. So I started it off in the house that I knew that was Easterfield.
But it's a thing. It is a thing about sort of being inspired by family and what the responsibilities, I suppose, that we have to those people, but also then how sometimes the actual imagined history of the family becomes realer than the actual history.
That's true.
So did you?
I suppose I fictionalized a lot, because the truth is, Tess, the character, both as a child and as an adult, is not my aunt. You know, the truth is that comes out of my own mind. So even though they share biographical details, and of course all the little events that happened to Tess as a child, whether it is her relationship with the dog or with the workman, are entirely fictionalized. I had to travel back in my mind to the 40s. and imagine their life then in the house, and a little girl losing her mother. And from the short story, You Fill Up My Sentence, I had written that in a very close third person to the child. And when you're writing from a child's point of view, I think it's hard to get it exactly right, but you really do have to try and go into the consciousness of a child, which is very, they live very much in the present, like an animal. You know, they're not going to be worried about the future. They're worried about who will make my tea, or I need to pee, or there's a stone in my shoe.
Or who's going past the house, as apparently is bothering our dog.
Exactly.
Apologies for any barking that's going on in the background.
So the inner life, the interior life of the child and the woman Tess is very much made up and of my own thoughts in a way. And I did, you know, getting back to, I did not consider that I was writing an immigrant novel. I did not, at the time as well, people, you know, soon after that, the Tuam babies and all the Magdalen Laundry cruelties, etc., had emerged. And I was asked about the fact that I had given Tess, you know, she's an unmarried woman who has a child, and in the 60s, that would have been very impossible for her to do it at home in Ireland. And of course, I was writing this story entirely because I needed to write the story. The character, I was driven by character and image. I have absolutely no, I had no intention of writing anything that was in any way social or historical, or making a comment on women's lives, or on Irish culture, or Irish historical norms or values. It would be anathema to me to set out to do a theme or to say something. I'm not a social historian. So my only loyalty would be to story and character. As it happens, it was a comment, of course, on immigrant life, or it was a glimpse of fictional immigrant life anyway, and women's lives. So that's enough, a byproduct, if you like, of the fiction.
But I suppose the truer the character, the more reflective of the environment that they came out of. So, you know, they're not in a vacuum. So it's a kind of a credit to you that you were able to make that world so believable. So then take us on to, because so there was, exile is I suppose a loaded term, but you know, and Tess wasn't in exile per se, but the next novel, the latest one, The River Capture, has a sense of a character in exile from his life, and you very much play with this idea, because the other big influence in that novel is James Joyce, our most famous literary exile, I suppose. So was it coming at that idea from another angle, or are there connections between the two, or I suppose how did it happen? How did The River Capture happen?
Yes, they're very different books, and there was absolutely no intention to make it one thing or another. I had a story originally. I had intended to write The River Capture from the point of view of Ellen, Luke's aunt, who was a woman who had spent a lot of her time in America, a woman who had endured a great wrong, and it was going to be from her story. And it would be a woman probably stronger in character than Tess, but not dissimilar in a way. And I started out with that intention and that idea, and her story was, you know, going to have a major event in it, historical. And as I started writing it, of course, Luke, her nephew, began to present himself as the dominant character. And within a short while, within starting it, weeks into it, it became obvious that it was Luke's story and not Ellen's. Ellen was there, certainly, and she had a part, but it became Luke's story. And Luke is, you know, you might say he's in exile from himself in many ways, because he has lived a vibrant life in Dublin. He's a 34-year-old teacher, very interested in books, very interested in the life of the mind. He had a long-term relationship with a girl in Dublin, and now he's returned back to his country home and a big house and a farm. Most of his relatives are dead. He has one living aunt, and family is important to him. But one of the things that I suppose it really, ostensibly, it's a love story. You know, a girl appears in his door, a young woman appears in his door. There's an immediate attraction. And then there's an obstacle down the line, a family historical connection that throws everything into disarray and pitches him into a crisis. So ostensibly, it is a love story that goes awry, but I never really gave the love story part of it that much significance. It didn't, for me, in the writing of it, it didn't have that much significance. For me, it slowly emerged that it was Luke's quest for consciousness. It is his journey towards consciousness. Now, that might sound like something lofty and ideal, but it isn't. He is, from the beginning, trying to find meaning. He's looking in books, he's looking in nature, he's interested in science and evolution, sexuality. He has a wide and intense engagement with life. And he's looking for, I suppose, he's looking to be more aware. He's trying to find the self in Jungian terms. He's trying to individuate. And there is this pressure to do that. And of course, usually, we change, or we have major shifts in our consciousness after crisis. Often great suffering is part of it. It comes unbidden. It's not like we intentionally asked for it. And this is what happens to Luke in a way. So he is, he turns inwards, when he moves back to the country. It's a time of dormancy, if you like. He reads a lot, he's drinking a lot, he worries about his own psychological stability, he thinks he might be a little bipolar, and certainly he's given to great raptures and great surges of thinking and ideas and theorizing. He is a philosopher as well as being interested in nature. He is, I suppose, he is.
He's very like it's Stephen Dedalus, though, isn't he? I mean, just in terms of that questing self, trying to understand the world on his own terms. And let me read you a quote from the review of the book in The Guardian. Melissa Harrison said, "To take on the ne plus ultra of literary modernism and bend it to one's own ends is an audacious act of literary ventriloquism, and one that Costello pulls off astonishingly successfully." So, and I think because as the book progresses and there's a point where the style and the format turns into something very Joycean in terms of a sort of a question and answer shape. And I think we do get something along those lines in the Portrait of the Artist as well, don't we? That sort of catechism.
Ulysses,
Ulysses. So at what point did you sense that there was a kind of a Joycean imperative in Luke's thing, or was that something that critics are seeing more than you did?
Oh, it was very conscious. I was looking, from the beginning, Joyce was a big part of Luke's life, as he is of mine. I had studied Joyce in college, obviously, and read portions of Ulysses, as we all do in college, but never fully mastering the whole lot and I had read it on and off over the years. But about 7 or 8 years ago, I reread it. I would have it on my kitchen table when I lived in Dublin, and reading it all the time, and got sucked into it hugely. And I had read Ellman's biography, and I'd read Joyce's letters over the years, different times, and always loved the man. I always found him a very sensitive soul, very refined. He was all the other things too, reckless and a spendthrift and a drinker, but it doesn't often get mentioned that he was incredibly polite. He had exquisite manners and very sensitive soul, and Bloom, of course, is a man full of compassion. He's a lover of humanity. He speaks out against cruelty many times. There isn't one act of cruelty, not one act of cruelty in Ulysses, apart from throwing a biscuit tin in The Citizen, I think, in Cyclops, throws a biscuit tin. There's no violence, no cruelty at all. And throwing a biscuit tin can hardly be called violence or cruel. So, and that's what appeals to me. And yet Joyce goes with Bloom to everything. It's the daily record of a man's mind, the high, the lofty, contemplating the stars, philosophy, science, medicine, art, music, everything, right down to the base instincts or the materiality of the body. flatulence, going to the toilet, frying food. Everything is considered. The sacred and the profane, sex, sexual deviancy, everything, instincts, high and low. And to do that, you know, it's just so supremely intelligent of Joyce. So the book and the man always tempted me. And it would be my desert island book, you know, so it never leaves me. And in those years, especially, I was really immersed in it. And I live with him almost every day. I never forgot him. You know, I had been to Zurich to visit his grave. In Philadelphia, I'd gone to see the manuscript in the Rochbach. I can't remember the name of the museum. And all the sort of things that you do when you're in love with some writer. You go on the pilgrimages. And Dublin, I could never drive past the Mullingar House in Chapel Lizard without thinking of Izzy and Earwicker and Shem and all of them inside, and Olivia inside in the back garden. I can never separate, you know. And like everyone else who's read Ulysses, walking around Dublin, you cannot not think of, you know, the diners and the Burton, you know, when you turn into off Grafton Street. So
but it's a brave writer to take that on in literary form.
I know people have said this. I never thought of it as brave, because if you think about it, and you know, Irish writers get constantly asked, do you not feel the shadow of Joyce, or the giant on your shoulder, Joyce and Yeats and Beckett? But when it comes to Joyce, I consider he's my best teacher. He gave me permission to do anything with form or with language, of course, provided it's good enough, and can't be the judge of my own work. But he gave me permission, and he wrote not for the academy, not for academics. He wrote for the common man in many ways, and his life of Bloom is common, but there's no such thing as a common man. There's no man who's ordinary or woman. Everyone's extraordinary. But when I was working on Luke, to leave Joyce out, Joyce is such a part of me. When I was working, I was fully immersed in him. To leave that out of the writing, every writer knows that what their love is, what their obsession is, bleeds into the work. So to leave out Joyce, and I did a little bit in the beginning, thinking I was holding back, putting on the brakes a little bit, thinking,
Well, presumably, if it had been Ellen's story, had it been the aunt's story, it wouldn't have been.
So it bled in and leaked in, and to not let it in as naturally and as organically as I did would have been to self-censor, and the writing would have lacked integrity or honesty, or certainly it would. So it fed in, because Luke is on this journey towards consciousness, and Bloom is his soul guide in a way. Luke is trying to be a better person. He's trying to be a better man. He's trying to live the examined life. And Bloom is a man who he's studying intensely and feeling an affinity with him. They both are, you know, want to do better for their communities. Luke is trying to better the place. He feels compassion for the boys around the town who are neglected. You know, he feels outrage at anything that's unjust, and which he inherits from his father. So, and then of course, when it comes to the crisis, when there's a revelation halfway through the book, which threatens the love that he has just found with the young woman Ruth, and he's tested. He's pitched into a crisis because her family had done something to his family, and family is important to him. And I did want to. It came naturally. He queries, why is young romantic love, he knows this woman only a month, why is romantic love placed higher than familial love, the love of a woman that he knows since he was born, an older, vulnerable woman? You know, because a few times critics or people have said to me, why would he give up the love of his life for his aunt? And I never fully understood it, because he has cared deeply for it. And also the other thing I often got asked for, you know, this young man of 34 is caring for elderly aunts. Well, I know several men. Often it's assumed it's women who look after the old or the elderly relatives. I know several men who are equally as caring and considerate and tender with their elderly relatives. So it wasn't that I wanted to buck any trend. I wanted to be realistic, that this happens. So when it comes to the crisis, and he is pitched into this crisis, he's blindsided, he does not see it coming. And in those minutes and hours, or 12 hours after, we remain with him. And it is a record of his emotional fragmentation, if you like, at that time. He is pitched into this crisis. And he goes off course in a way, just like the river, which is the thematic heart of the book. It changes course, it's usurped or captured by another river. And his life suddenly goes off. And I wanted, I did experiment, and, this book has been called experimental, and it is true, because I did not want the normal, regular narrative to continue in a linear form. To me, it wasn't sufficient. To continue in a regular narrative wouldn't have accommodated what he was feeling and what had happened to him. I did try out writing in fragments, which is often used as a way of detailing and recording and reflecting the breakdown of a mind or things going askew in someone's consciousness. And it didn't work. And it certainly wouldn't have worked for Luke, because Luke is very mathematical, he's very smart, he's very rational, scientific. So I remember the day it happened, it came to me immediately. My best teacher, Joyce, gave it to me. Ithaca, the question and answer section of Ulysses, is my favorite part of Ulysses. I read it and reread it. I love it to bits. And I love the intensity and the soaringness and the letting rip of it. So immediately I knew, as soon as I gave it a thought, I knew I had my answer, because we stay up close and we track Luke's mind in the minutes and hours after he's had this revelation. He goes to drink. We follow him as he's doing his chores around the house, and all the thoughts that go through him, his tasks, his physical movements, his memories. A backstory comes out. Every single thing in his study, his drawers, comes out. And so I wanted a method or a form to accommodate this crisis, which a linear narrative would not accommodate. And to me, the question and answer met that need, because instead of feelings, we get facts. I didn't want emotive language. I didn't want a spilling out.
But maybe because of that, there's still at sort of plot, and from the reader's point of view, this dread that something awful is gonna happen. And like, again, that river metaphor just seems to feed that. So it's as if you're kind of intensifying that feeling by suspending it momentarily into that very subjective experience. I'm really just curious and nosy about the process for you at that stage. Were you getting reader reports from your publisher? None of that was happening?
No, I never give any bit. No, I wouldn't. I would be ashamed. I only give it out when it's as good as I can get it. It doesn't mean it's perfect, but as good as I can get it. Martin, my partner, reads it when I have it finished as well. But so when I had the final, and he was very helpful. But no, I work on it all the way through, and only then. And later on, speaking of the river, actually, the river was a significant part of it. And when I started, before I started writing at all, before I started the novel, the river capture, the phenomenon of a river capture was significant. I didn't know it would become the thematic heart of the book. I didn't know it would be a metaphor for what happens to Luke. And it happens to be a metaphor for many things. Afterwards, I realized, for instance, his sexuality takes a sudden turn. Ellen's life took a sudden turn. Ruth's, his own life takes it. So there are many sudden diversions. A river capture is where one river changes direction suddenly. Its flow is usurped or captured or pirated by the flow of an older, lower river. And Luke lives on the bend of this river. The river Sulan is where his family farm and land and house is situated. And he's always been aware of, I suppose, the sentience. He is very in touch with nature, and he's aware of the unity of things. He thinks a lot about water. He thinks about the scientific makeup of the water molecule and how maybe the answer to everything, the code of life, is in that. So these are the sort of thoughts he has. So he's very aware of the damage that can be done with pollution and the environment. And then the river itself, he sees as, when he thinks about the river capture, he imagines that this is an ancient wound. At one point, the river lost its original destination, like a worm cut in two. And he feels this rupture, maybe still in the landscape, felt in the landscape, like a limb severed or losing your sword, losing the beginning separated from the end. And he feels this almost grief for the rivers, for the catastrophe that happened in the river's existence. And he also, in that way that I suppose Joyce maps the psychogeography of Dublin, Luke is mapping the psychogeography of the region, because he's feeling that maybe this damage, this great river capture, which would have happened millions of years ago, had repercussions on the landscape. He's aware of high levels of depression, addiction, neglect in the town, and the big ancestral Anglo-Irish houses like satellites all the way around. That the pain and the wound of the river is still manifest in the district and in the people around. And when at the end, he has a living encounter with the river, if you like, he has an encounter with the river, which is, as I came to that section, I was aware that it was like slaying the dragon. It was like the hero's quest. And in the beginning, I had this feeling that it would be Luke's own, not so much a baptism, but as a sort of a transforming moment, that he encounters the river, enters the river, encounters the river, and is witness to its pain. That somehow he sees some sort of a continuum between what he recognizes, that he is a witness to the river's pain, and he enters it. And that, to me, was what I originally intended Luke to do. And I didn't know how I was going to get there, but that was his moment of transformation, I suppose.
Well, you very kindly agreed earlier to maybe read a little from it, so it seems like a good moment to maybe just hear a bit. And I don't know if the river was going to appear in the bit that you were going to read from, but
I'll read this a little bit anyway, because it's got a little description of Dublin in it, and this is from the early part of the book. And Luke is back home in Ireland, but when he back home in the countryside where he lives in the banks of the Sulan. And when he lived in Dublin, he was a teacher, and he taught in Belvedere for some time, and he lived with Maeve, his girlfriend. And now he's back down, and he's thinking about these moments. So I'll read about a page and a half. Okay. Moments like this, he longs to be back in Belvedere. That morning walk across the city from Harold's Cross, pigeons on the footpath, raucous gulls overhead, buses pulling out from the curb, spluttering exhaust fumes on passing cyclists. All the lives parallel to his own, all the moments in which different things are simultaneously happening. Horizontal time, thoughts and musings that seem to go on for hours, but take only minutes. No one understands time. Impossible to measure too. If it weren't for time, if it weren't for death, we might not count time at all. Under the arch at Christchurch, his watch reading 8:35 a.m., 8:36, 8:37. Vertical time. Downhill then, and a whiff of the Liffey, and a blast of wind bracing on his face. More gulls screeching overhead on the North Quays. The world their oyster. The world was his oyster then too. He had his life all mapped out. A few more years in the city, then he'd come back here with Maeve, work the land, fill the house with kids. Mammy, Josie, Ellen, the whole happy racket, like in the old days. Up Jervis Street, around Parnell Square and into Denmark Street, as the Mercs and Beamers and Range Rovers pulled up, dropping off the uniformed sons of doctors, lawyers, judges. He was always moved by the way the big boys took their little brother's hands and led them inside. He gets a lump in his throat thinking of them, everything about the place. He felt close to Joyce there too, and Stephen, thinking he was Stephen, leaning down to help some weak, misty-eyed boy. Moments when he felt himself simultaneously and symbiotically fused with the sweet boys before him and the image memory of the young, innocent Stephen Dedalus in those very rooms 100 years before. Regularly going off script, off the curriculum, spending weeks teaching nothing but Ulysses. Certain scenes, Stephen in class, Bloom with the cat and the kidney, the men in heydays trying to bury the dead. Such mirth Luke had with his class, such wordplay and punning, the boys decoding, mapping it out, acting it out. Sir, Leo Burke just ate with relish the inner organs of Beatty and Fowler. Shut your obstropolis, Carney. Sir, there's a tang of faintly scented urine off me sandwich. Oh, ineluctable nodality. Oh, jumping Jupiter. If he ever has a son, he will send him to Belvedere or Clongowes. For all their faults, the Jesuits' ethos of care and service still prevails. Like Dada, always setting example. No need to have any truck with the old boys network.
Wonderful, wonderful stuff. I'm sort of conscious that we're beginning to run out of time here, and I did want to ask about next projects, but the way you've been talking about the river capture, it's clearly still so much a presence in your imagination and your thoughts. Is it difficult to clear headspace to begin work on the next thing, or how, has the lockdown helped, or how's that going?
It is. I'm just beginning to maybe start some notes for the next project, but there are times when nothing at all, and I remember that after Academy Street 2, it was about a year and a half after it was published before I was able to start again. And, you do worry that you're a one-trick pony or a two-trick or whatever, but, and so be it. If I never write another thing or never publish, so be it. But I think the urge and the impetus and the impulse is still there. And I am starting something new now. I don't know what it'll be or what it'll turn out to be.
Do you know whether it'll be long form or short form? Or
I don't. Sometimes I think I have some essays I want to write and some short stories. I love short stories still. But I don't know what shape it will take. And I just have to go with the flow, Mm-hmm. But, and yes, river capture, I suppose Joyce never leaves me. There were times that I have to remember he's dead. There were times when I was writing the book and I thought, I can't believe he's dead. I'd still grieve for him. He wasn't even 59. There was, and there are times when I still think, part of Bloom happened. There's a scene in Ulysses where Bloom's father, Rudolf Virag, had committed suicide in a hotel in Ennis called Queen's Hotel. And when I was writing it, I looked it up and it's still there.
Wow.
It specializes in hen parties now. So one day we took a trip down there and it was and I went in and asked the receptionist, could I go upstairs? And I was walking around the corridors trying to imagine Virag Bloom. He took some poison in one of the rooms. Of course he didn't, it's fiction. Mm-hmm. But I was going there thinking, so that's the way, the Joycean aspect is still very much alive. But anyway, getting back to your question, I am starting to work on something. I couldn't work on much during lockdown, like most people could barely read because it does create some sort of a disturbance in the psyche of everyone. But yes, it is kind of a relief to know that maybe I can again, but I go slowly.
Well, we will very much look forward to whatever happens next. It's been such a pleasure to chat to you about everything that has come up to this point. And I wish you very much, you don't need the luck, so the time and the headspace to do whatever comes next. So Mary Costello, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thanks very much, Nessa, for having me.
And that's it. Thank you very much for watching on. We'll be back again in another little while with another wonderful guest, and in the meantime you all take very, very good care of yourselves.
I dream 'cause it's the closest I'll ever get to you.